Hello, today I'm going to be going over an informal assessment strategy called the Muddiest Point. The Muddiest Point is an exercise where the instructor asks students what part of a course, of a homework assignment, of a laboratory session, of a film, of any learning experience was the muddiest. And by muddiest, I mean most unclear, hardest to comprehend, most puzzling, most confusing. In Thomas Angelo's book, Classroom Assessment Technique, this one right here, he summarizes this exercise as students responding to the question, what was the muddiest part of blank? The students write down what was the most difficult to comprehend, what was the most confusing part of a learning experience, and then they write it down. After writing it down, the instructor looks at all the different muddy points and clarifies the most common muddy points in a learning experience. So the Muddiest Points strategy was originally conceptualized by Harvard professor Frederick Mosteller in 1989. The whole goal of the strategy is to give students another chance at comprehension of an area that they were kind of stuck on, that they found the most puzzling, that was the muddiest, with the goal of increasing their understanding of course materials. What's great about the Muddiest Point strategy is that it can be used in almost any classroom setting. It can be used in synchronous online classes, asynchronous online classes, and in-class classes, like in-person classes. While this technique works quite well in large enrollment classes, specifically lower division classes, such as first year college or university courses, it can also be used in smaller classes. It's highly adaptable. The question is usually posed at the end of a lecture, at the end of a film, at the end of any kind of learning experience, and it can be used more frequently in courses that are especially information dense. If there's a whole bunch of information coming at you and you are finding yourself constantly, wait, what was that? I didn't really understand that, then you can use it more frequently. Muddiest Point is most applicable to courses that are focused on Bloom's remembering and understanding levels of cognition, as opposed to the higher order levels of cognition, such as applying, integrating, evaluating, and synthesizing. But that does not mean that it cannot be used in courses that are focused on more higher order thinking. Now, like any learning assessment strategy, Muddiest Point does come with its limitations. One study on how delivery impacts student perceptions of anxiety found that the implementation of Muddiest Point can actually induce a low to moderate level of anxiety for students, for some students. However, a little bit of anxiety can come along with any form of learning assessment. And as I just recently mentioned, this strategy is less applicable to courses that require more higher order thinking. Thomas Angelo mentioned in his book that the colloquial phrasing of Muddiest Point might confuse some students, especially students who are relatively new to the English language. If students get too focused on a Muddiest Points activity, then they might be focusing more on what they don't understand. That can actually take away from focusing on the concepts that they do understand. Also, for those with high expectations, they might be disappointed to find that extra clarification does not always guarantee immediate resolution, immediate understanding of a concept that they're stuck on. Now let's look at the advantages of Muddiest Point. Muddiest Point is simple to apply, it's simple to analyze, it's time effective, it requires very little energy investment, and it has a high information return. As I mentioned earlier, Muddiest Point is pretty much universally applicable. A research article on planning lessons found that the implementation of Muddiest Points can actually boost student confidence if used regularly. Finally, this can be a useful strategy for instructors to use as it helps them identify which topics to emphasize on, or if they need to change the method of delivery of a certain part of a lecture. Maybe it's not coming across clearly to most students and they need to teach it in a different way. Maybe there's a particular concept that needs to be taught in a way that's more comprehensive to students. So some best practices for Muddiest Point. It should be used at the end of a learning session, not the middle of a learning session, unless there is a ton of information that students are expected to process. In that case, using it more frequently can be helpful so long as it doesn't interfere with the timing of the learning session. And as for timing, the instructor should be reserving enough time to introduce the activity, to describe the activity, to allow students to perform the activity, to collect responses, to provide feedback. Even though Muddiest Point activities can be relatively quick, they still might be taking up more time than expected. Another good practice is to estimate what student responses will be before collecting them, and then you can compare your predictions with the actual responses to gain insight into how the class is going. It's also important to let the students know how much time they have to respond, when the feedback to their responses will be given, and what their responses will be used for. Finally, instructors should be responding to student feedback about the Muddiest Point assessment as soon as it is possible and ideal to do so. So I'm a culinary instructor, and the classes that I teach are entirely hands-on. There is not a lot of opportunity for written assignments. So the way I would be providing feedback for a Muddiest Points exercise would be mostly orally, given at the end of a cooking lesson while we're all sitting down eating the meal that we just made. I will be sure to include some of Thomas Angelo's guidelines for providing effective formative feedback. I will let the students know that this is a group feedback session, just so they're aware. I'll also remind the students that everyone struggles with at least some concepts, and that not immediately grasping a concept says nothing about their learning abilities. So as a group with the students, I'll address the most common muddy points, I'll make an attempt at clarification, and then I'll ask the students, I'll check in with them and see if the muddy points have been cleared up a bit. If some students are still struggling with the muddy points in question, I'll ask other students to explain the muddy points in their own words. If we start to get to a point of collective clarification, then I'll just ask the students to provide some examples relating to the muddy points in question, so that we can promote a bit of knowledge solidification. And that's my video on Muddiest Points. Thanks for watching.